Well, for me, it all started with Mars. I had a astronomy class at the University of Utah, and then I went to Caltech for my PhD, and I majored in plant physiology. I'm basically a biologist, plant physiologist. But I took this minor's course in geochemistry, and old Harrison Brown, it was a seminar course that just went continually, and we had speakers come in. It was pretty neat, actually. And old Harrison Brown, who had set it up, decided one quarter that we should look at the solar system as a setting for Earth and its geochemistry. And to get a grade, we had to write a paper, and it had to be an original contribution to knowledge. And I wrote a paper about life on Mars because I was a biologist, and that seemed the thing to do. And it was a good paper, and it was an original contribution and all that, and I got a B anyway. And I've been bitter about it ever since. But it did get me into the hobby of Mars to begin with. And as I'll mention in a moment, that got me into UFOs. Here's Mars, and here's a couple of the best color pictures that were ever taken through telescopes from Earth with Earth's shaky atmosphere and all that. And you can see markings on Mars, and it turned out that the markings would change with the seasons. Here's the polar cap, southern polar cap, because telescopes invert the image. And as winter turned into summer, the markings got darker. And to get the right face, you had to take them at different years, but nonetheless, that's pretty impressive to me, and it was impressive to a lot of people, and I've hardly heard it discussed for the last 10 or 15 years. But among other things, I hired an airplane in Flagstaff, Arizona, and flew over the painted desert of northern Arizona. The guy got clear up to 18,000 feet. He shouldn't have. We didn't have any oxygen or anything, but he did, and I took these pictures, and we both were fine. That's the picture of how it looks from 18,000 feet, and this is a picture of how it looks from the ground, and there are plants there, as you can see. This is Bill Simpson, I think, who was an astronomer at Flagstaff. This one has quite a bit of vegetation. So my point at that time was that if the markings on Mars consisted of vegetation, it must be quite dense. And this hobby developed, and I did, like John Greenwald said, I gave a bunch of talks, and it became clear that I was moving in the direction of maybe there's intelligent life on Mars. And the reason that I moved in that direction is that Percival Lowell had written 3 books right around 1900 talking about the canals on Mars and talking about the cities that were located at the nodes of the canals. And I guess I've got a pointer. And people were excited about that. 50, 60 years later, they were still excited about Percival Lowell's books on Mars. He was a good man. I wish I had time to tell you a lot about him, but I don't. Anyway, eventually I ended up writing a cover article for Science magazine, which is the granddaddy of the science journals. Actually, the editor heard me give a talk and asked me if I'd write the article, and I did. And in the article, toward the end, after speculating about the kinds of vegetation and emphasizing that it probably didn't consist of lichens, which was the popular theory at that time, I speculated about intelligence, and there were 3 possible evidences for intelligence, the canals. And this map is the official Air Force map, and I don't have a date, but it was about 1965. And as you can see, they were convinced enough that they included the canals on the official Air Force map. Most astronomers didn't see them, but the ones who did were really convinced. Then Mars had a couple of moons, Phobos and Deimos, and they have very close orbits, and they're different orbits from the other satellites. And real optimists said, maybe they're artificial satellites on Mars. And lastly, there were flashes of light that had been seen on Mars occasionally, very rarely. But I cited those three evidence for advanced civilizations on Mars. And as you well know, in 1964, when the Mariner sent back the first real pictures of Mars, most of this all fell apart. My fun was over. We didn't see any canals. We didn't see any cities. We did see huge volcanoes, which conceivably might have produced flashes of light now and again. We saw Phobos and Deimos up close, and they're big chunks of rock, just like any other asteroid captured to be a satellite. But nonetheless, because I included these thoughts about intelligence on Mars, people noticed the article, and I hate to brag, but I was driving home from Denver up to Fort Collins, where I was located at Colorado State University, and I heard Lowell Thomas, who was a famous newscaster at that time, mention my article, and I thought that was so great. Anyway, I got a book and a letter from Cora Lorenzen, and I started corresponding with her and decided that their approach to UFOs, she and her husband Jim, was a logical approach, and I got interested, and I started throwing in UFO stories and evidences in my Mars talks, and this was one of the evidences was the correlations of Mars and UFO sightings. I don't know what to make of that, but it was one of the things I did, and I don't know whether you all remember Amy Michel's Great Circle UFO alignments. That's pretty impressive, actually. I started showing, I dug up these old slides from a drawer where they'd been hidden for ages. And at one of those talks, there was Junior Hicks, a junior high school science teacher in Roosevelt, Utah. And after the talk, which was at my old alma mater, South High, after the talk, which was a teacher's convention, he came up and told me about these great sightings they'd had in the Uinta Basin. And the Uinta Basin is in, I keep thinking I can point to that and you'll see my finger, but you don't. But you do see that. The Uinta Basin is in the northeastern corner there of Utah. It's got three main towns, Duchesne and Roosevelt and Vernal, and then a whole bunch of somewhat smaller towns scattered around. And Junior Hicks told me that people had been reporting to him, and he had been writing down their reports about UFO sightings, and that they were spectacular. And I remember standing up on the stage after that talk he'd come up and telling me 2 or 3 of these sightings, and I was excited and thought I ought to pursue that. But of course I didn't. I was busy doing a lot of other things. And one of the other things that I did was write a couple of articles about UFOs that were published in Bioscience. And I'm semi-proud of those because there aren't many scientific articles published, positive articles, published in the accepted scientific literature. Well, Devin Garrity, who's a publisher in Old Greenwich, Connecticut, called me on the phone and said, why don't you expand this first article into a book? And I said, send me a couple of $100 and I'll go over to Roosevelt and I'll interview these people and do that. And he did, and I did. And Junior Hicks and I went out and interviewed 20 witnesses from the 80-plus sightings that he had in his file. Where are you, Junior? Right there? Yeah, when I'm talking about you, I'd like to know where you are. We went out and interviewed these people, and I tape recorded them, and my secretary transcribed them and became a converted UFO investigator. The interviews are tremendously impressive, and I had almost forgotten, but I'm trying to revise the UFO book, and I retyped the whole thing in the last month, so I'll have an electronic version to work with in revising it. And boy, rereading those interviews, I was going to save it to the end, but I'll say right now that reading those interviews is why I cannot deny that the UFOs are some kind of real phenomenon and not the imagined sort of thing that the skeptics would like to have you believe. Well, thanks to Coral and Jim Lorenzen, with whom I had become quite close by then, I ended up on this National Enquirer Blue Ribbon panel. Oh, there's some of the drawings that Junior Hicks's witnesses had made. As you can see, those are not little spots of light moving around off in the distance. Those are very impressive sightings, and many of these objects were close. Some of the witnesses would say 50 feet away, and they would use terms like big as a house. And anyway, oh, there's Junior Hicks and me back in the good old days when we were young. And there's the Blue Ribbon panel. Leo Sprinkle and Jim Lorenzen and Jim Harder. I heard last night that, well, we know that Jim Lorenzen has died long ago, and Jim Harder recently died, and I don't know whatever happened to Bob Cregan. Here I am still. J. Allen Hynek has passed the scene too, but it was an interesting experience with this panel. We sat around and opened letters at the first meeting. Over 1,000 letters had been received by the National Enquirer when they offered a $50,000 prize for proof that UFOs were of extraterrestrial origin and guided by intelligence. And it was clear from the over 1,000 letters that none of them came close to proof. They were people who had had strange experiences that they couldn't understand and wanted to share them to get them off their mind. I can't imagine why they would think that it would consist of proof. They were just stories. And they could have been lying. And in a few cases, they undoubtedly were. And that's the point. This Blue Ribbon panel really made me consider what proof means. To do science, you got to have objective data. And that basically means that you've got to be able to repeat the data. And as you all well know, you don't repeat UFO sightings very well. You can't go back there and tell the UFO to come back. And so that's the first really big problem that we encounter. How do you get objective data? Well, the least you can do is formulate hypotheses and talk about what's possible and what isn't possible and what might be. And Stan Friedman last night gave a lot of examples of that sort of thing. Anyway, we spent a lot of time considering the possibility of, the question of what would it take to really be proof. And pretty hard to come up with an answer. The only answer I could come up with was what Stan mentioned last night: land on the White House lawn and say, "Take me to your leader," and call in the TV companies. And I would insist that not only the president would interview the extraterrestrials, but that the Queen would come and the Pope and a lot of people, because otherwise it could be faked. And that's always the basic problem. What can be faked and what can't? Well, I've been interested in that problem, not only in relation to the UFOs, but in relation to the question of basically evolution by the natural selection of random mutations. This is the standard biological thing, and it works. Mutations occur, and they are random, and some of them get selected. Most of them get selected to die, but I see serious problems with all that, and I spent my retirement years after I wrote a couple of books earlier about these matters, as early as the 1960s and then 1976. But they were basically books aimed at my church. And in the last few years, I wrote a book entitled The Case for Divine Design, and the title was put on there by my publisher. And I don't like it in a way because it says that I am an intelligent design creationist. And I'm not really, except in the sense that I do believe in God, and I believe God had something to do with it. But I don't know what. I only know that you can make a case. And I'm saying all this, of course, because I've got some copies of my book out there on the table. And I just want you to know that. The main argument, or one of the main arguments in that book, and it relates to the UFOs, and I quote some UFO things in it because the relation seems so clear. The skeptic who would have you believe, A, that there are absolutely no such things as UFOs. If you only had all the data, you could eliminate them all. And B, that evolution will indeed work by the natural selection of random mutations. And it'll work, but I can't bring myself to accept the idea that that will totally account for it. I think there's not only intelligence guiding UFOs, but there's intelligence in creation. And like I say, I don't know how much, or whether it was started at the beginning and then all went by evolution, or whether it got intervened with all along the way. But the way that the skeptics get around this is they come up with what I call just suppose stories. We meet a problem that we don't have a good solution to, and we cannot repeat the evolutionary step or the UFO sighting. The evolutionary step, because it maybe happened 300 million years ago. The UFO sighting, because you can't repeat UFO sightings. And so you come up with a cooked up explanation. And I kind of like the term just suppose story, or what if story, or it's plausible story. That's where we are with much of science, and particularly evolutionary science. Evolution is supported by a lot of evidence and a whole lot of just suppose stories. UFOs are in pretty much the same situation. They're supported by, you know the evidence, and I know the evidence, but the person who has a mindset, and I want to talk about that, the person who has a mindset refuses to accept them and makes up a just suppose story to account for everything. And if he just absolutely can't do it with a just suppose story, then he says, oh, it was a hoax or it was a lie. That's kind of the last resort. And how do you prove that it wasn't? Well, you can get a lot of circumstantial evidence that would convince you and me, but the skeptic doesn't want to be convinced. And if he's got a just supposed story, including hoaxes and lies, that's enough for him, her, as the case may be. Yeah, I do know a her who is a debunker. And her name is Susan Clancy. Is that familiar to you? Yeah. I read her book just a couple of weeks ago. Well, I wanted to talk about what is proof, and I want to mention a little bit about photographs. And the bottom line about photographs is any photograph can be faked. I just cannot believe a photograph that by itself proves anything. There's a lot of photographs out there, and they may very well be genuine. The reason I liked Mr. Browner's photograph was that he was on the deck of a Brazilian Navy ship, and there were 100 sailors, some at one end of the ship and some at the other, and they all claimed that they saw it. Two possibilities. One, Mr. Browner faked the photo, and two, all of the sailors conspired to tell the story. And unfortunately, both of those things are possible, and I don't know the answer. I think that this is really a valid photo of a UFO, but I couldn't prove it. And as part of the exercise, while I was still in Fort Collins, I left there in 1966. I left Colorado State University and went to Utah State University, but this is Horsetooth Reservoir up in near Fort Collins, and I took my secretary, Jean Livingston, out there and had her point at the UFO that wasn't there and took the picture and raced home and developed it just like Mr. Browner did. I was kind of a semi-professional photographer for many years, photographed a lot of weddings and babies and portraits and things, including my second wife's first wedding. How about that? Anyway, the point of this photograph is that you can fake any old photograph. The problem of faking a photograph like that is that a double exposure won't do it. Exposure has to make the object lighter than the sky, not darker. And so I dreamed up a way to make it darker without, there could be witnesses and they could come down and watch me develop and everything. And so the bottom line is photographs are interesting and important, but by themselves are not proof. And you're going to hear that also from others, I'm sure. Here's some fun. People sent me these as real photographs of UFOs. I've just got 3 of them, but they were also in that drawer with those old slides. Look at that. That's supposed to be a UFO. And obviously it's a little disc that somebody threw and took a picture. Well, now I'm going to divert and tell you about Captain Guido French of the Black Eagle Space Patrol. Captain French, and I'm not dead sure why I'm telling you this story, partly because I found the pictures and I like them. But it does have at least one take-home lesson. Captain French sent us a letter, the first meeting of the Blue Ribbon Panel, and he included pictures of two young ladies from Mars. And he told us that he would take us to Mars in the spaceship Neptune. Well, we laughed, of course. As a matter of fact, we did a lot of laughing that day as we passed these letters. we'd read a letter, and it would be so fascinating, we'd have to stop everybody else from reading it so they could hear this. And by the end of the day, the sensory input, I was just a dish rag. But anyhow, we laughed at Captain French's letter, but then I said to Alan Hynek and the others, Alan Hynek because he was from Chicago where Captain French lived, I said, you know, if he'll take me to Mars in the spaceship Neptune, I'll vote for the prize. And that would be proof, for me at least. I might have trouble convincing everybody else. But if he'd take me and maybe the rest of the panel, of course he might not come back, that'd be the end of that, I would vote for him. So in those days, United had a hub at Salt Lake City and at Chicago. And so wherever I went, I had a layover at O'Hare Airport in Chicago. And Captain French had come and meet me and bring Martian ladies. One of them was a brain surgeon. And one day, one Sunday afternoon, I met him and had a couple hours, and we went to a rental place and rented a lawnmower, and he brought with him a couple. These are not the sexy ladies that we met. These were secretaries, he said. They're not from Mars. We bought a gallon of distilled water, poured it in here, and then Captain French added some black powder to it, which the Black Eagles had taught him how to make, and lo and behold, the water turned into gasoline, and here it is burning. It might explode. So he was proving to me that he had secret knowledge from the extraterrestrials because he could turn distilled water into gasoline. Well, and this is one of the sexy ladies that he sent to me at the O'Hare Airport one time. She is from Mars. Well, I was not convinced by Captain French's gasoline trick because when he poured the black powder into the water in the trunk of his car, he said, "Oh, no, you've got to stand back about 100 feet. It may explode. Get away." And so I got away 100 feet, and that was the end of the demonstration for me. From then on, it was just fun. I led him along for years. I don't know whether, as investigators, you know, but I bet you do, that the way to get lots of good stories from people is to act like you believe what they're telling you. And they open up. I mean, if you're skeptical right at first, then they're going to clamp down. And I led him along for weeks and months, and finally, he was going to I realized that he was manipulating things so well that I was backing out of the trips to Mars. I can't go to Mars during test week, after all. And so when I realized that, I thought, I'm going to push this guy to the limit. And so I did. And he was so convincing. And the day before, he was going to pick me up with a spaceship Neptune, and I was going to be a few miles out in the empty place, but I could bring a friend who would say goodbye to me, and we'll have everything for you, but bring a clean shirt and your toothbrush. And I got to the point where I thought, maybe I ought to buy some film, just in case. And maybe I should write a will. And got right down to the moment of truth, and he called, and the Black Eagles had decided he was not doing his job as an outside publicity man for the Black Eagles, and the trip was going to have to be called off, and his secretary was on the phone too, and she was going to go, and she was so disappointed. And interesting. Take-home lessons are hard to come by from that story, except that one take-home lesson is, why would he pull off a scam like that? Incidentally, years later, he wrote me a letter, and proposed a Nigerian-type scam. There were huge gold bars buried in a mine in Illinois, and if I would help him get them out, 1/10 of them could go to my church. He knew that we paid tithing, and another 20% or something could go to me. Doesn't that sound like a Nigerian email? And at that point, I finally wrote to him and told him, I haven't believed a word you said all along. When you poured the black powder and made me stand back 100 feet, why, that was the end. And it was the end, except that I met two businessmen at the O'Hare Airport whom he had apparently taken in. They believed him. And it's kind of sad. I don't know whatever happened to him. He's quite a bit older than I am, and not many people are older than I am at this stage, so he's probably gone. Well, let me see now. You can see I'm no good at just reading talks, and so now I got to find out where I was. When I wrote the book, I cooked up, I mentioned 5 UFO hypotheses, of which you are all well aware, I'm sure, but I will mention them. Natural or conventional phenomena misinterpreted. And that's the common one, and it applies in many, many, many cases, as you well know. Lies or hoaxes apply in some cases, and we can cite examples, which I'm not going to do. Secret weapons or other government projects. That's one I don't believe. Well, there could be a few things that were government built that were mistaken for UFOs, but that's not the answer to the phenomenon. And my argument is they've been around too long. The flying shields of the Romans, and you know the stories. Tricks of the mind, psychological phenomena, multiple witness accounts and such. I can't apply that explanation, and I can't apply it in the Uinta Basin sightings. Can't prove it didn't apply, but if it did, if they had a mass hallucination, why, that's as fascinating as the spaceship idea. Nevertheless, I think it's tremendously important to realize that witnesses can be emotionally involved, can make mistakes, etc. And I have a story out of the Utah UFO display. And incidentally, I'm going to put a book out on my table where you can sign up if you want me to contact you when that gets published next spring, I hope. When and if. I got a call from a woman who had seen a UFO that morning. And because she ultimately sounds kind of foolish, I changed her name to Mabel. And here's what Mabel says. I got to read this interview to you. As I came out of the door and looked to the east, there was something just as big as that. And I thought, well, that doesn't belong there. And it made me feel kind of funny. And I looked across the mountains. I have a bad habit of looking up when I come out at 5:30 in the morning on my way to work in the university cafeteria. It was so bright. I can't tell you what would describe it. The intensity of it was just magnificent. It was just about that far above Mount Logan, and it looked so close that it looked like it could just set down. And then I said, did it have a shape, a depth, or was it a point of light? Mabel goes on, I picked up my girlfriend that was going to go to work, and I said, I'm going back home and get my field glasses. I don't know if we'll see more with them, but I'm going to get them anyway. I said, that's something that someone's sending her something from somewhere else. So I came home and got the field glasses, and when we got to the cafeteria, we were in the east dining room, and it was dark in there, and you could get a better view. It looked just like one of these big fish that you see in an aquarium. They're about this wide, and they have a big tail and a fin that comes like this and one like this. It was just about that shape. And then there was the mechanical part here, whatever it was, and it looked like it had a little streamer out of the side, and it looked for a while on the left-hand side, right in the middle, was a little streak of red, and the intensity of that was just great. I'll tell you, it just made you feel kind of weird. I said, it was above Mount Logan. Did it change its position? Mabel says, no, I didn't seem to. It was so brilliant. It's just a shame that someone didn't get a telescope so you could bring it right up to see. I took the glasses out just before we went out for breakfast about 5 after 9, and at that time, it was higher up here in the heavens, and it was still quite bright, but it was about the size of a pinhead. Of course, the sun was up then. It was daylight, real bright. But it was something fantastic. As a matter of fact, it made you feel just kind of insignificant. I wasn't alone. There were all the people eating breakfast, and some of the others that came on duty went out and looked at it. But it was huge. It didn't travel too fast. It looked like it was going in the same pattern that these jets fly. If it was daylight and those jets were going over, I imagine they'd get a pretty good look at it. The black background maybe made it look bigger when it was dark, but it looked like it was going in the same path as those jets that come from the east and go right over Mount Logan. Well, I had to tell her she'd been watching the planet Venus. And how about the fish and the mechanical part and the red streak and all that? Clearly she hadn't focused her binoculars. And it was the day after, and so I was able to say, go out tomorrow morning. It'll be there, I can promise you. And I had heard that you could see Venus when the sun was shining, but I never had bothered to do it. And the next day, I did watch it. If you watch it when it's dark and watch it as it comes up so you know where to look when the sun comes up, you can see Venus in the daylight easily. Right now, I'm sure you could. It's a beautiful, beautiful morning star right now. Magnitude, what did I hear? -6 or something. It's brilliant. I took people from the office out, and we all saw it in the daytime. Unfortunately, that was the last I heard from Mabel. Let's see, how am I doing? Oh, I'm running out of time like I thought I would. The fifth hypothesis is that UFOs are extraterrestrial machines. And there are... you heard Stan Freeman last night, if you were here, and probably most of you were, strongly defend that idea. Almost he persuadeth me to be a nuts and bolts advocate. But not, I have worries and doubts about the nuts and bolts idea, that they are tangible machines. Some clearly are tangible machines, I think, but getting here from other planets. Stan talked about the time dilation. It wouldn't seem like 40 years to them, but when they went back, everybody would be 80 years older. And if it's anything like our society, and we don't know whether it is, I used the same arguments that Stan used last night, basically. Our physics is primitive, perhaps. It's only been around about 100 years. A little over 100 years ago, they were saying we've discovered everything there is to discover in physics. Now it's just a matter of extending the decimal points. And of course, that turned out to be utterly, utterly wrong. So who knows that we've discovered everything there is to discover? That's Stan's argument. It was my argument in the UFO display, and it's a valid, good argument. But I'm still uncomfortable with the idea. Getting here is one problem. Rapid changes in direction. I don't even remember what case this was, but it's was in that old drawer with other slides. And, somebody reported these UFOs switching instantly, going in the opposite direction, or going back in the direction they came. Makes me uncomfortable. Made J. Allen Hynek uncomfortable. He mentioned that they could be holographic images projected. It wouldn't take, our technology is capable of producing a solid-looking image with laser holographic technology. And it's easy to flip the projector so that it does a thing like that. And that's an idea that I think needs to be considered. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the Playboy panel. On February 22nd, 1976, a bunch of us were assembled, namely J. Allen Hynek, Leo Sprinkle, Jacques Vallée, and I, in the home of Murray and Barbara Fisher in Los Angeles. And we sat around and talked about UFOs for ages. And then Playboy magazine transcribed them all. Incidentally, I may be the only Mormon with a Playboy interview. They transcribed all the stuff we had to say, and then they passed it around. And they sent it to Jim Harder, who couldn't be there for some reason. He's a very strong UFO supporter. And they sent it to Phil Klass and to Ernst Tavies, who were debunkers. I guess to the day of their death, they were debunkers, which again illustrates the point that mindset is very powerful. And that's the reason I mentioned this story. Luckily, this transcript was passed back and forth for 2 years before it was finally published. And during those 2 years, we would add stuff, and Klass and Tavies would shoot it down if they could, and Jim Harder would tell them why they were crazy. And it's a 16-page interview, three columns of small type. And I was pretty impressed when I reread it for the first time in years and years and years. And we covered essentially everything that we'd cover now. But the bottom line of that story is the bottom line is the importance of mindset. We probably could not have been convinced that UFOs were all phony, and Klass and Tavies could not have been convinced that they were not. As far as they were concerned, they were all phony. And they brought up case after case, and it was very much like what Stan Friedman had to say last night. Oh, and incidentally, I got a thing from the Skeptical Inquirer day before I left. If you want to know how to shoot them down, you go to the Symposium on the Space Age Mythology, October 9 to 11, 2009. Featured speakers are James McGaha, David Morrison, Robert Schaefer, and Dave Thomas. These are the current debunkers. And I'm not going to go. Kind of wish I could. I like to know what the enemy's saying. Mindset is tremendously important. You've got to either debunk or defend. There seems to be very little in between. I try to be as in between as possible, but like I said already, I'm convinced that there's something real, and I'm mostly convinced not because of all the literature that's out there, but mostly because old Junior Hicks and I went out and old is the operational word, isn't it, Junior? Junior Hicks and I went out and interviewed these people in their incredible interviews. How do the debunkers debunk? They make up just supposed stories, like I was saying. And I had here, if it weren't for that clock, I had here a fairly complete account of the Captain Coyne thing that happened. Don't I have the date? Yeah, October 18, 1973, near Mansfield, Ohio. Captain Coyne is flying his helicopter back to the air base. His people see this red light approaching at terrific speed. He tries to go into a dive so it won't hit him. It comes and hovers over him. They see it about 50 feet long, grayish, metallic. Red light in the front, the green light in the back that swivels down and lights up their cockpit. It came from the east. It goes off to the north. Well, Philip Klass did a wonderful study of that case. He spent months on it. He interviewed Captain Coyne and the crew, and he interviewed people in the tower with whom they were in contact by radio, and he interviewed other people of this, that, and the other. But his mindset said, some way that's got to be explained, because there's no such things. And he couldn't, of course, get past that. So he learns that it's during the Ornid meteor shower time, so it's a meteor. And it comes from the east, and of course it's red because it's burning in the atmosphere. What do you do about all the other details? Well, you make up just suppose stories. You say it maybe had a trail that they misinterpreted as the object. And he had some explanation for the green light that swiveled down, but it wasn't very convincing at all. And why did it go off to the east or to the north instead of the west where it should have? Well, maybe they got their directions mixed up, and with enough just suppose stories, you can talk your way out of the best of cases, I guess. He never tried to talk his way out of the cases that Junior and I have, and I've often wondered what he would have done. He'd have had to say that people were lying or hallucinating, and I just don't believe that. I can't prove that they weren't, but I don't believe it based on talking to them and knowing what kind of people they are and all that. Anyway, that's what he did, was make up a just suppose story. Now, in the printed version of this is one of the interviews that Junior and I had. It was one that he told me about up on that stage at South High when I first met him after my Mars UFO talk. And because it was one of the best that he had, but it's a good one. And the witness at that time was Joanne Harris, and I think I'm going to tell you the story. Matter of fact, I didn't even, to save time, I didn't even put the interview in my notes here. Joanne Harris and Estelle Manwaring are serving local missions for the Mormon Church. And Joanne Harris is living in Randelette, which is south of Highway 40 a ways. And Estelle Manwaring is living over in Vernal. And Joanne brings a couple, maybe 3 or 4, Indian girls and one large Indian woman up to Roosevelt, and Estelle brings one Indian girl from Vernal. And they play a volleyball game, and then they go home. And on the way home, Joanne is coming around the bend down toward Randelette, the two part where Estelle goes east and Joanne goes south. Joanne is coming around a bend, and they see this little light off there, and it's below the horizon. That makes it interesting. It's night, of course, and all of a sudden the light starts coming toward them, and there's Joanne, pretty girl. Of course, that was 40 years ago. Haven't seen her since. Well, you can tell how we changed. I had that earlier picture. She describes an object like this. These are models that Junior made, and he made them to scale. She said it's as big as a church at Randelette. And the object she saw had this dome on top. Here I am pointing, and you can't see my pointing. Had this dome on top, and was flat on the bottom, but there were no lights. And the thing comes right at her, and pretty soon it gets within, you can't estimate distances, but it's filling the windshield of their car. It's huge, right there. The Indian girls in the back seat are fighting to get on the floor. The large Indian woman is under the glove compartment, that ought to be proof enough for UFOs. Joanne, who is driving, has put the thing in reverse to back up to get away from it. She looks around, sees a car come around the bend. When she looks back, it's gone. The car comes around the bend. She follows the guy home, and Randlett asks him if he saw it, and he didn't, sadly. Wish he had have. But Estelle is going east along Highway 40, and her Indian girl says, "Look at that funny star out there." And yeah, that is a funny star. Maybe that's one of those UFO things. And they drive along for a little ways watching it, and then they turn into a driveway, which at that time was the Smith Music Center. Is that right, Junior? And they're now looking south, and here's this funny star that's beginning to have a shape they can see. It's about maybe a quarter of a mile away. There's a row of trees there that they help them judge the distance. There's no way to judge it accurately, but that was their estimate. It was big enough that they could see the shape, and it was this shape. Oh, there I go again. It was this shape. But it was flashing lights like mad around the edge. And they watch it. As they pull up, they're watching it. And they park to watch it better. And Estelle flips off the lights, and it goes. And she said that she almost hurt her neck, tipping her head back to see it go up. It went that fast. She says, "I have a Pontiac, and the windshield tips up over there." And anyway, I think that's a pretty good sighting. There were a whole bunch of witnesses. The thing was so close you can't. It was definitely not the planet Venus. And that's typical of the other 20. I'd like to tell you about Tarina Daniels, who followed a big red ball all the way home from Vernal to Roosevelt. It was right in front of her car and sometimes over the car, lighting up the road, flames going out the side to the fence lines. I mean, these are not little damn lights off in the sky, as J. Allen Hynek used to call them. Well, let's see. Anyway, those are the kind of stories that make me I utterly try to avoid the term believer, because I'd like to fool myself into thinking that I'm a scientist being objective about the UFO phenomenon. And I'm not a believer in what they mean and where they come from and how they operate and all that. I'm only a believer that there's something out there and that they're real and that they're intelligently directed. That seems so obvious in all of the cases. There's no way to get around the intelligent direction business. Well, maybe you know about this book and maybe you don't. The author is here. I don't know if he's in the audience. Hope he is. Colm Kelleher. You said I had 20 minutes. I've only got 15 now, or less. Because I'm tempted to tell you about this interesting coincidence that I had. Maybe I better not. Well, the coincidence is that Mary and I are sent on a LDS mission to Columbus mission in Columbus, Ohio. And the first time we go to church there's Junior Hicks visiting his daughter. And I thought that was a pretty fantastic coincidence. He invites us over to his daughter's home, and we go over and have dinner a day or two later. And he tells me about this strange ranch that's not too far from Roosevelt, and the strange things that are going on at that ranch. And I bought the book after I got reactivated, so to speak. I never did really emphasize why I got deactivated, and the reason was that I was having theological thoughts, and I figured theological thoughts don't match scientific objectivity, and I better just back off and sit on a fence and see what happens. And I sat on the fence for 30 years. I'm still on the fence. But I am back thinking, while I'm watching more closely now from my fence. Junior told me about these strange things, and I bought the book and read it. And the strange things involve a lot of appearances and disappearances. Animal runs off, leaving tracks, and then is gone, and the tracks end. Sometimes this was seen. Mostly it was not. Just the tracks disappeared. They maybe see the animal go off into a... And they're strange animals. A wolf that was 6 feet high. The witness that they're talking about in this book, and much of this stopped when Bob Bigelow, who was here, bought the ranch, and they did the study on it for 2 years. And there was some activity that they were able to record, but much of it stopped, which does not surprise me in view of the fact that I think these things are intelligently directed. One of the witnesses, there's this orange door off in the distance in the sky, and the UFO will come and go into the door and disappear. And they end up speculating about the possibilities of parallel universes or other dimensions or something. And I don't know what to make about all that. But these are the kind of thoughts I've been having in the last 2 or 3 months. Namely, maybe instead of 5 hypotheses, you can put them together in 3, one of which wasn't included among the 5. Hypothesis number 1 is the debunker. Debunk them all. Any UFO sighting can be understood if enough data are available or could be available, and it's that could be. That's always a way out for the debunker. Well, if we only knew this, we could explain it, as Stan explained last night. Natural or constructed psychological phenomena, lies or hoaxes. But it's impossible to get the data. We only have witness accounts. So you invent just suppose stories, which may be plausible, probable, or maybe strongly contradict what the witness tells you, as in the Captain Coyne situation. And I could, umpteen examples of that type. How am I doing? I'm out, more or less. Well, no, I just used up my hour. I can't believe that. Okay, that's more like it. Well, anyway, it would be fun if I had time to tell you about how Menzel and Davies debunked the legend of Christ walking on the water. It was an inferior mirage. But in that case, and I have no idea whether the legend is true as it's recorded or not, but the point I want to make is that it is recorded in the Gospels, and every detail is given, and it took place at night, and there was a storm, and Christ came up close to the boat, and Peter tried to go out and meet him. You've heard the story. Well, Menzel and Davies say, they have a picture in their book with an inferior mirage. It can look like he's standing on the water, but he's really on a spit of land out there. Well, that's great, but that occurs in the middle of the day, and it has to be a considerable distance away. The mirage enlarges them. What I'm saying is that in order to make their hypothesis fit that story, they had to ignore all the details except walking on the water. Everything else was legend, had been put into the story, and so on. And that's so typical. The reason I like it is, like I say, the facts are all in one spot. And you're not depending upon witnesses that, well, you are in a sense, but anyway, it's all written down. Well, you can't be sure because of the impossibility of repeating the experience. If you're a debunker, well, you eventually fall back on lies or hoaxes. And if you do, what you got to do is find a motive. Class shot down the Delphos, Kansas case as a hoax, and he almost convinced me. Maybe he came very close, because in that case there was a powerful motive, namely a $5,000 reward from the National Enquirer. And he took care of a lot of the little dealies. So who's to say? Number two is the nuts and bolts idea that Stan Friedman still strongly defends. Highly advanced machines from other solar systems. I still worry about special relativity, interstellar travel in reasonable times of rapid motions. But more than anything else, I worry about the things that they do. And it's the same answer if you want to defend a hypothesis. Why, you say, how do you know what they do? They have their own personalities and their own motives and so on. And that's a valid answer, but I am still just plain uncomfortable with many of the strange things that I've encountered and that you've encountered. Well, that leads us to the what I call the third hypothesis. This is the Kelleher-Knapp hypothesis, sort of, although it's been around. They wouldn't insist on taking credit, but they do describe it in their book rather nicely. Physicists are talking about wormholes that will take you from one point in the universe to another almost instantly. Special relativity that Einstein produced in about 1915 allows that. Physicists are also talking about other dimensions. It's not an impossible thing, but it surely is something that you have to sit on the fence when it comes to this hypothesis. But the hypothesis, I can say, does appeal to me. And I'm going to, well, yeah, that's what I just said. It would answer the problem of appearance and disappearance, or coming out of wormholes and going into wormholes, whatever wormholes are. The best case that I can make is that this kind of thing goes way back into history. And I have to mention religion. I've totally given up long ago trying to relate the UFOs to my religion specifically. So this is a very general kind of a thing. Incidentally, a guy in our church by the name of James Thompson did write a book in which he tried to relate the whole UFO thing to specific Mormon philosophy, theology. And I wrote a foreword to his book. He didn't convince me by any means, but I'm glad he did it, so I don't have to. First off, there's the folklore and the fairies and the demons that Jacques Vallée talked about. They appear and disappear sometimes. Second, the best examples in our Western world concern the three religions. Like UFO accounts, all of these things are based on witnesses, however. Three examples from Christianity. Saul's vision on the way to Damascus. Christ appears to him. Later, he bears testimony. I'm winding up. In 1 Corinthians, he says, and last of all, he was seen of me as of one born out of due time. So he bears a personal, individual testimony. Luke's testimony, of course, is secondhand. Well, the question occurs, where did Christ come from if he appeared to Paul on the way to Damascus? And where do UFOs come from? a spectacular example, which is really only one verse in the Bible, and if you're a skeptic, you can talk your way out of it pretty easy, but the verse says that Christ appeared in a closed room. The only way to get in a closed room is through a wormhole, I think. And I would be disingenuous if I didn't note that I could tell you other examples from the history of my own church. But if I did, you'd think I was trying to convert you, so I won't. But look them up, and you'll be... Well, scholars, of course, debunkers, dispute the authorship of the Gospels. When the Gospel stories first appeared, however, they were accepted like wildfire throughout the Mediterranean area. And many of them were first-hand accounts, like Paul. Peter was around, and Peter bears a very powerful first-hand account in his letter relating to the Mount of Transfiguration. Well, were all the people who accepted these stories just plain stupid? Or did they sense that the stories were authentic, as I do when I reread the Uinta Basin interviews? The two, to me, relate very closely. Obviously, there are examples from Judaism, many, many. I don't know about Islam because I don't know much about Islam, but I do know that Muhammad was taken into heaven, which you could say was a wormhole event. And I would point out that skeptics who call themselves scholars, of course, and are, reject these ideas by falling back on various just supposed stories, which they call interpretations, hypothesis, and so on. But I'm trying to teach you the term just supposed story. I think it's pretty handy in these things. Well, imagine what would happen in our world if we unlocked the secret of the wormhole, the Stargate. What if we could go where they come from? That's almost a frightening thought. Suddenly all of our scientific and public philosophies would change. No wonder our visitors don't want to make that kind of formal contact to give that secret away. Nonetheless, they seem to want us to know that they're there. They provide all these witnesses, both in religions and in places like the Uinta Basin. I only mention that because that's what I'm familiar with and talking about. You know the huge story of UFOs all over the world. Well, who are they and what do they want us to know about them? As far as the religion ones go, they claim to have the answers. As far as we UFO investigators go, we don't have the answers. We just have some just supposed stories ourselves, like the Stargate. At the moment, that's my favorite just supposed story about where UFOs come from. But that's at the moment. And I need to really emphasize that. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to worry about these things at my age. That their approach to UFOs, she and her husband Jim, was a logical approach, and I got interested. And I started throwing in UFO stories and evidences in my Mars talks. And this was one of the evidences was the correlations of Mars and UFO sightings. I don't know what to make of that, but it was one of the things I did. And I don't know whether you all remember Amy Michel's Great Circle UFO alignments. That's pretty impressive, actually. I started showing, I dug up these old slides from a drawer where they'd been hidden for ages. And at one of those talks, there was Junior Hicks, a junior high school science teacher in Roosevelt, Utah. And after the talk, which was at my old alma mater, South High, after the talk, which was a teacher's convention, he came up and told me about these great sightings they'd had in the Uinta Basin. And the Uinta Basin is in, I keep thinking I can point to that and you'll see my finger, but you don't. But you do see that. The Uinta Basin is in the northeastern corner there of Utah. It's got three main towns, Duchesne and Roosevelt and Vernal, and then a whole bunch of of somewhat smaller towns scattered around. And Junior Hicks told me that people had been reporting to him, and he had been writing down their reports about UFO sightings, and that they were spectacular. And I remember standing up on the stage after that talk he'd come up and telling me 2 or 3 of these sightings, and I was excited and thought I ought to pursue that. But of course I didn't. I was busy doing a lot of other things. And one of the other things that I did was write a couple of articles about UFOs that were published in Bioscience. And I'm semi-proud of those because there aren't many scientific articles published, positive articles, published in the accepted scientific literature. Well, Devin Garrity, who's a publisher in Old Greenwich, Connecticut, called me on the phone and said, why don't you expand this first article into a book? Article toward the end, after speculating about the kinds of vegetation and emphasizing that it probably didn't consist of lichens, which is the popular theory at that time. I speculated about intelligence, and there were 3 possible evidences for intelligence. The canals, and this map is the official Air Force map, and I don't have a date, but it was about 1965. And as you can see, they were convinced enough that they included the canals on the official Air Force map. Most astronomers didn't see them, but the ones who did were really convinced. Then Mars has a couple of moons, Phobos and Deimos, and they have very close orbits, and they're different orbits from the other satellites. And real optimists said, maybe they're artificial satellites on Mars. And lastly, there were flashes of light that had been seen on Mars occasionally, very rarely. But I cited those 3 evidence for advanced civilizations on Mars. And as you well know, in 1964, when the Mariner sent back the first real pictures of Mars, most of this all fell apart. My fun was over. We didn't see any canals. We didn't see any cities. We did see huge volcanoes, which conceivably might have produced flashes of light now and again. We saw Phobos and Deimos up close, and they're big chunks of rock, just like any other asteroid captured to be a satellite. But nonetheless, because I included these thoughts about intelligence on Mars, people noticed the article, and I hate to brag, but I was driving home from Denver up to Fort Collins, where I was located at Colorado State University, and I heard Lowell Thomas, who was a famous newscaster at that time, mention my article, and I thought that was so great. Anyway, I got a book and a letter from Cora Lorenzen, and I started corresponding with her and decided that, and I said, send me a couple of $100 and I'll go over to Roosevelt and I'll interview these people and do that. And he did, and I did, and Junior Hicks and I went out and interviewed 20 witnesses from the 80-plus sightings that he had in his file. Where are you, Junior? Right there? Yeah, when I'm talking about you, I'd like to know where you are. We went out and interviewed these people, and I tape recorded them, and my secretary transcribed them and became a converted UFO investigator. The interviews are tremendously impressive, and I had almost forgotten, but I'm trying to revise the UFO book, and I retyped the whole thing in the last month, so I'll have an electronic version to work with in revising it. And boy, rereading those interviews, I was going to save it to the end, but I'll say right now that reading those interviews is why I cannot deny that the UFOs are some kind of real phenomenon and not the imagined sort of thing that the skeptics would like to have you believe. Well, thanks to Coral and Jim Lorenzen, with whom I had become quite close by then, I ended up on this National Enquirer Blue Ribbon panel. Oh, there's some of the drawings that Junior Hicks's witnesses had made. As you can see, those are not little spots of light moving around off in the distance. Those are very impressive sightings, and many of these objects were close. Some of the witnesses would say 50 feet away, and they would use terms like big as a house. And anyway, oh, there's Junior Hicks and me back in the good old days when we were young. And there's the Blue Ribbon panel. Leo Sprinkle and Jim Lorenzen. Winter turned into summer. The markings got darker. And to get the right face, you had to take them at different years. But nonetheless, that's pretty impressive to me. And it was impressive to a lot of people, and I've hardly heard it discussed for the last 10 or 15 years. But among other things, I hired an airplane in Flagstaff, Arizona, and flew over the painted desert of northern Arizona. The guy got clear up to 18,000 feet. He shouldn't have. We didn't have any oxygen or anything, but he did. And I took these pictures, and we both were fine. That's the picture of how it looks from 18,000 feet, and this is a picture of how it looks from the ground, and there are plants there, as you can see. This is Bill Simpson, I think, who was an astronomer at Flagstaff. This one has quite a bit of vegetation. So my point at that time was that if the markings on Mars consisted of vegetation, it must be quite dense. And this hobby developed, and I did, like John Greenwald said, I gave a bunch of talks, and it became clear that I was moving in the direction of maybe there's intelligent life on Mars. And the reason that I moved in that direction is that Percival Lowell had written 3 books right around 1900 talking about the canals on Mars and talking about the cities that were located at the nodes of the canals. And I guess I've got a pointer. And people were excited about that. 50, 60 years later, they were still excited about Percival Lowell's books on Mars. He was a good man. I wish I had time to tell you a lot about him, but I don't. Anyway, eventually I ended up writing a cover article for Science magazine, which is the granddaddy of the science journals. Actually, the editor heard me give a talk and asked me if I'd write the article, and I did. And in the article, well, for me, it all started with Mars. I had a astronomy class at the University of Utah, and then I went to Caltech for my PhD, and I majored in plant physiology. I'm basically a biologist, plant physiologist. But I took this minor's course in geochemistry, and old Harrison Brown, it was a seminar course that just went continually, and we had speakers come in. It was pretty neat, actually. And old Harrison Brown, who had set it up, decided one quarter that we should look at the solar system as a setting for Earth and its geochemistry. And to get a grade, we had to write a paper, and it had to be an original contribution to knowledge. And I wrote a paper about life on Mars because I was a biologist, and that seemed the thing to do. And it was a good paper, and it was an original contribution and all that, and I got a B anyway. And I've been bitter about it ever since. But it did get me into the hobby of Mars to begin with. And as I'll mention in a moment, that got me into UFOs. Here's Mars, and here's a couple of the best color pictures that were ever taken through telescopes from Earth with Earth's shaky atmosphere and all that. And you can see markings on Mars, and it turned out that the markings would change with the seasons. Here's the polar cap, southern polar cap, because telescopes invert the image. And as